Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet. Welcome to the podcast, Father.
Well, as always, a great blessing to be with you, Colleen.
It's great to have you here in the studio, Father, and I'm so excited to hear about your trip to Ireland, your recent trip to Ireland, which is what we'll be talking about today. So we'll cover what's been going on in Ireland, what the state is there, the cultural situation that's going on, especially regarding life and family issues, and then what you and Patrick McChrystal did on your recent mission trip there. So I'm
Great.
excited to hear all about that. And could we just start by giving our audience a little just update / like setting the context of like what is the situation in Ireland right now?
Sure. Well, and the way to kind of express that is to kind of talk about the mission itself. So, HLI Ireland, is very active throughout the country of Ireland, and not only with pregnancy care centers right now, there are 3 that are open. There is now work for opening 2 more centers across Ireland. I actually had a chance to visit the center, meeting the new staff in Moynihan. So this is one of the great works that HLI Ireland, in their leadership through Patrick McChrystal, the director for HLI Ireland, has been very actively engaged in trying to bring to the forefront, like we do in all of our mission around the world, how do we care for families in need? How do we care for moms in need? So this is a wonderful work. So I was able to visit the one in Derry, which is also very beautiful and very active. And Miss Kate does phenomenal work there with her staff. So quite a blessing. So, but part of what's going on in Ireland is what makes these works so important is, as I mentioned in a column that's going to be coming out very soon on the issues of Ireland, but in using a conversation about St. Patrick, kind of lead into that, is really to kind of talk. What's the current state? What's happening? And what I noticed is that Patrick in HLI Ireland and his staff picked a very important theme. And I know that we've linked many things going on in Ireland with our affiliate there and our partner in this great work. And that is, the Holy Face campaign, many of the spiritual things that they're doing to really awaken within Ireland their spiritual heritage, which goes back to St. Patrick, who was not the first missionary, but obviously the one that most people are familiar with.
Yeah.
And so in the 5th century. So when you look at this, so the theme for this was, how to reclaim the sovereignty of Christ, whereas the centrality of God in Ireland that seemingly has been lost in people's view and approach in life. And obviously always underneath it was the theme of Our Lady, under the tender care of Our Lady. And many of our audience may not even be familiar, Colleen, with Our Lady of Knock. And I know we don't have time for that, but that in itself would be something I would encourage our listeners to learn more about. Our Lady appears there, in a very different manner than she had done anywhere else in apparitions around the world. And particularly, that I would just say, give them a little clue, she's wearing actually a crown that you don't always see. And people say, wait a minute, she wore a crown in Fatima. No, she did not. And so why? So the sovereignty. So that we use this message of Our Lady of Knock and the sovereignty of her Son is how to reawaken people in Ireland to their heritage, the true beauty that God has given.
What is the current cultural state of Ireland regarding things like abortion and LGBTQ ideologies and euthanasia? Because I think that's sometimes helpful for setting the context for our listeners who don't necessarily follow the cultural shifts in Ireland the same way. They might hear buzzings of them legalizing abortion or things like that throughout the past decade or so.
Right.
But could you just give them a little insight into what that looks like at the moment?
So, sure. And I mean, obviously, Ireland is, in the sense of its heritage, its culture, its root, is Catholic.
Yes.
And so we know that from, the great writings and teachings and interventions and the whole 40 years that St. Patrick, almost 40 years of preaching the gospel and leading, the community of faith there, and all the wonderful things that emerged. And what I mean by that is we think about the world, how we have benefited from the Catholic faith in Ireland. Many saints, many blesseds, many missionaries went around the world, and to bring forth the good news that came from this little island, and made a huge impact around the world. And so when people think of Ireland, they think of this. Yeah. But what they don't realize is that Ireland, being part of the Western world, heavily influenced by ideologies from Europe, from the West, has invaded And because of so many things that we've seen in recent history, so like the difficulties between, that we saw in the 80s and so forth, and into the 90s, and with regard to Northern Ireland, with the Republic of Ireland and so forth, and so all these difficulties are there, and so all this brings in mindsets, it brings difficulties in. So just to kind of background that, so as a result, what do we have? We have the invasion of these ideologies. And if I may, I'm going to put a little comma, because recently while there, this is something that was brought to my attention, at least in conversation, and it's very good insight by many of the clergy. And what they said, and it's just their view, so I just share it that way, is their perspective. And these are older priests now, 50 years of priesthood. So they have enough history there to see, in that, as we have seen around the world, when there is a lack of formation, a lack of catechesis, a root that really helps form heart and mind, and the conscience itself is well informed. If those things are not present, then when these ideologies make their way in, as they do, and they're very intrusive, they get into the schools, they get into the educational systems, as in Ireland, both public and Catholic. We have, what we call the whole sex perversion education programs make their way in. And what happens is that if there's not enough root to be able to deal with that, and there's not enough vigilance from parents and Catholic leaders to recognize what's happening, then all of a sudden, as we've seen in other parts of the world, you start watching this turn. And this is what the priests were sharing. And they're saying that, sadly, we had and they said, just this, again, their perspective, looking from the outside, people see, the Irish church, they see the faith of the people, and they see all the various images and symbolisms, all beautiful. And they said, all rich, and the great saints and the great blesseds that have come from our wonderful land, that our land is given to the church universally. At the same time, we didn't take enough time to make sure that the root was planted deep. And that was what it referred to was catechesis, formation, understanding, so that they could better articulate their faith, not only understand it from the sense of liturgy or from devotion, but how to take all that and be able to articulate it and to be able to be governed by it. And so what happened, many of the youth began to fall away, being easily attracted by what's happening in the universities, by what's going on globally. Obviously, internet, as a blessing as that can be for communication, it also brings much with it that we are not looking to have. And so what happens? Eventually, in 2015, what do we see? We see the legalization of same-sex union. In 2018, we see the overturning of Amendment 8, which is about 3.5 decades old, with regard that protected human life, that understood the Irish Constitution itself protected life, and Amendment 8 reaffirmed that and strengthened it. And then what we see in 2018 is the overturning of that. And now what we're seeing is, with that, is all the other ideologies, all the various other isms, as John Paul would say. And so what's happened is, it's like a tsunami. It's very overwhelming. And then we also have a demographic problem, because as we see in all of Europe, and in Ireland now being part of that European conversation, its total fertility rate is very low. It's 1.4, 1.45, which means they're not welcoming children. They are causing difficulties to themselves by not even replacing themselves. And I just said, one of the things I do when I travel, as you know, Colleen, I do a little research on statistics. And just an example, for a population of 5.4 million, almost 4.5, let's say, that in 2024, there were only 54,000 births. And of that, they've also buried nearly 40,000 people. So we can do the math in the sense, what is the gain? But as a result, what people don't remember is now, because abortion is legal, basically there was no gain, because they aborted the difference. And so, or near the difference. And so this is a real challenge, that's there. And so what do we see now is the government trying to push an understanding of MAID, medical assistance in dying, i.e. euthanasia. Because why? Now we have an aging population, and we have a less tax base. How do we pay for things? Socialized medicine. So it's a litany of issues, Colleen.
I'm confused by the numbers. So what you're saying is that 54,000 children were born.
Correct.
And 40,000 people died.
Right.
And then because of abortion, there was another 14,000 people who aren't being counted in either statistic because they were killed before they were born.
Correct.
So if you were to apply that to the death statistic, they would be the same.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
cool. I just wanted to make sure
That's
I
right.
understood that
No,
because
no,
I was
that's correct.
confused.
That's correct. Yeah. It's
Okay.
just the idea that it just shows you that, even though the number of births exceeded the number of Irish people that were buried,
Mhm.
right? But in reality, because you have abortion that is also occurring, you're also destroying human life,
Mhm.
and so when you start looking at how that number is continuing to grow and the way the numbers are reported, at least what I've seen for 2024,
Mhm.
basically almost nullifies that 14,000 people that you
Mhm.
would have quote unquote gained in population.
It's so interesting when people do statistics and leave abortion out of it because I remember someone sent me an article about Texas heartbeat bill,
Right.
and they were arguing that infant mortality, like, increased, like more infants were dying because children that would have been aborted who had like some type of like issue, like
Mm,
something like trisomy 18, were being allowed to be born. And then their death was counting towards the infant mortality
right.
statistic. So it was
Right.
like,
Right.
well, before abortion, we had this low infant mortality statistic, and now it's
Right.
higher. So more babies are dying. And no, the same amount of babies are dying. You're actually fewer babies are dying because you're not aborting the other ones. But
Right.
like, when
Right.
you're counting your statistics, if you
Correct.
conveniently leave out abortion, it looks like it's a good
Exactly.
number when
What we
abortion's
need is Dr.
legal.
Brian Closen here, who loves the numbers, and as a statistician, just in a sense of working in all
Hmm.
those numbers. I mean, he just sits there and tells you. So that's why I appreciate when he does travel with me. He wasn't with me in Ireland because
Hmm.
he would dig into that data and he
Yeah.
would he would present it, and it's really an eye opener when you present this information to the local people because
Hmm.
they're not looking at that, they're not seeing that. So when we come in and we kind of expose the underbelly of
Hmm.
what's really going on underneath this conversation,
Yeah.
and just to show that your population is not only decreasing, but it's decreasing because of a path that's been chosen.
Hmm.
So as we've talked about here in our podcast of a recent column I wrote about the United States, when some of the surveys and statistics are showing that when you look at of the Catholic population, about 90% are using some form of contraception.
Hmm.
Well, we can transmit that over to another country and look into some of their numbers and realize again it's a self-inflicted wound. And
Hmm.
so when you ask what's going on in Ireland, well, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
And so because contraception has been accepted and has been normalized within most of the Western world,
Hmm.
right, sadly finding inroads into the developing world because of the
Hmm.
Western world. And so and also what we see is rising in divorce rates.
Mm.
I mean, in every city I went into, Colleen, it was sad and broke my heart to listen, to parents or to actual, individuals talking about their wife has left them, husbands abandoned them. So in every place I went, so rising divorce rates, breakdown of the family, and as I've said many times before, when I travel, I love counting children,
Hmm.
and it doesn't mean there's not more children out there, but just physically with my own eyes.
Hmm.
So I traveled from Dublin all the way to Belfast. So
Hmm.
people can look at how many kilometers that would be. And so the idea is in those 7 days on the ground, my own little eyes only saw 25 babies. And I mean babies, carriage babies, little
Yeah.
babies in carriages or someone carrying. Doesn't mean they're not more, but my
Yeah.
own eyes. And I am very intentional in looking
Hmm.
because it tells me something when you don't see children, when you
Hmm.
don't see toddlers, when you don't see babies, or don't rarely or see a woman who's pregnant. It's very telling of something that the culture has sadly embraced, and that is it's abandoning,
Hmm.
the very fruit of love and the fruit of conjugal love.
I feel like, and I don't mean this with any shade to Ireland or the Irish people, if when I was over there last summer, it felt like there was some type of cultural despair. Like we were in these very small towns, and you think about small Irish towns and the Irish pub, and obviously as American tourists, we wanted to go to the Irish pub. And there'd be all these storefronts for all these old Irish pubs, and none of them are open. We'd go to some towns and they'd say, "Oh, the only place to eat around here is the like to go food."
Right.
And it just like, and apparently part of that was when Ireland joined the EU and they built all the highways. People started just taking the highways and they weren't going through these
Mm,
small towns, and so it wasn't like they weren't getting as much traffic to these
sure.
restaurants, and they had to close down. But it was just like sad to see these towns that just they felt like they had lost that like heart and that spark of a small
Mhm.
town that you think of when you think
Sure.
of Irish culture.
Sure.
And what you're describing is something
Right.
similar of like if you have a culture where you're not welcoming children, where there isn't that hope, where
Right.
there is this kind of despair about the future.
Right. And what's wonderful in each of the communities that we're in, though, so just like anywhere else, there is a spark, there is
Mm-hmm.
light, and there is always joy. And because when we live our faith and we live it fully and we see the good, and these are the people that we're meeting. We're meeting families, we're meeting people who are engaged in the conversation, people who
Yeah.
are interested in the conversation, people who are concerned about what's happening. And so,
Mm-hmm.
so as we have in our own country here, communities of faith that are bubbling up in different areas, and so
Mm-hmm.
that's where the faith grows, that's where change happens and transformation. And so part of the mission was, again, to remind those that do come,
Yeah.
you're the spark, you're the one that's lighting that fire, you're the one that's letting the light shine, you're the one that's in bringing about a transformation. and
Mm-hmm.
and so part of the mission, and you just gave an understanding, a lot of times our missions are really about to really encourage. The mission is not there to point out the errors, though we might speak of them, like we've been talking
Yeah.
about, the difficulties, the struggles, to look at what it is, how did we get here,
Mm-hmm.
all right? But also to point out that God is with us, we are not alone, and that the faith and the root is there, that the land is seeped with the beautiful, wonderful faith, and it is there. And you meet these wonderful people along the way. I mean, for example, there in a few days from now, I did a little video while I was there to promote on the Hill of Slain, where St. Patrick lit that wonderful Paschal fire and
Yeah.
in defiance of the king, which brought about really the king's blessing to Patrick.
Yeah.
He was so impressed with his fervor and zeal and willingness, and gave permission. And so as a result, so what we're seeing now is and I've always mispronounced some of these wonderful names, and so please forgive me for anyone listening. But Athlone is where the center of Ireland is. And this is where they're going to have this beautiful procession, So, and then I understand, from staying with some of the religious while there, that they're going to reconsecrate Ireland to the Sacred Heart on the Feast of the Sacred Heart, or near this feast. So it's not all as we're talking. When we start, not everything is bad. Not everything is falling apart. But I mean, there are these realities. But at the same time, you see these sparks, these wonderful lights, and that's exciting.
Have you ever heard the story that is, I don't know if it's true or if it's a pious legend, of St. Patrick's final vision?
I mean, I've heard different. So
Okay,
I want you to share it with me. So
this is one.
make sure
Yeah.
we're on the same one.
This is, like I said, I'm not sure. I've never super fact checked it. I found it on various Catholic sites, but I don't know what the original source was. But apparently, on his deathbed, St. Patrick had this vision of Ireland in flames, burning for love of God, and then this darkness starts to, creep across Europe. But meanwhile, Ireland just keeps burning and keeps burning. And then slowly patches of darkness kind of show up. And slowly all of Ireland is taken over by this darkness, except for these little pinpricks of light from the different fires from small areas all around Ireland. And then from there, that fire spreads all across Ireland again. And it kept burning until the end of time. And I like to think that those small fires are Patrick's First Saturday rosaries, but that's just my personal.
And here by Patrick, we mean
Patrick McChrystal, yes.
Director
So he
of
does
HLI
the
Ireland. Yes.
HLI Ireland brought the men's rosaries to Ireland to do on the first Saturdays of every month, and the videos of it are beautiful. To our audience, I'll link some in the description because it's really powerful to see. And I know that they've kind of been circulating on social media.
And the Holy Face devotion, and that's one of the things we talked about. So what you just mentioned there really is, I think it's so beautiful, and it's a way to kind of show that that because God is with us, I'm with you always, and even though we might reach sometimes a little precipice of life, and we're thinking all is lost or difficulties, all we have to do is go back in our own wonderful Catholic history and see that many missionaries returned to lands where the faith had been brought, but because of persecution and because of being ousted from the countries, and yet they find these wonderful little places of light. So, and I do believe, and that was part of our mission, is not to come in and just say, hey, everything is bad, let's just pack up our bags and let's go home. No, the mission was, these are the difficulties we face. This is how we've got here, are some of the reasons why we are where we are. Now, how do we get out of this? And so what we talked about there is quoting Chronicles, and that is in the Old Testament, that those who gaze upon his face will be saved. So by raising back up Christ and raising up what is good and true and beautiful in every age, And even when we don't see it anymore, even when we don't hear it anymore, even when people have become immune in a way to it, calloused, if you will,
Yeah.
it is still there. The truth is still there. And that's the big challenge, of how we're going to rekindle, right,
Yeah.
this wonderful flame. And not only in Ireland,
Mhm.
but in many parts of the world. But this program is about Ireland. So I walked away after 7 days of moving around the country with a sense of hope.
Mhm.
So even though in each of, like I said, each of the villages and towns we were in, and the programs we had, you would hear all the difficulties and knowing much what's happening. But at the same time, there wasn't a sense of being oppressed, feeling
Mm.
down, feeling downtrodden. Instead, the Lord would just introduce you to these beautiful souls
Mhm.
that you just were shining and bright, even as they shared their pain. I'm not going to go too much detail because maybe they might be listening, but I'm not going to tell a name anyway. But the idea, I remember a mother talking about the sadness of her son who's going through a divorce
Mm.
and how painful it was. And you can
Yeah.
see it in her face. And yes, she says, if without my faith and without my confidence in God and knowing that God will see me through, I don't know where I would be or where my family would be.
Yeah.
That's beautiful because it shows that her faith is not something external.
Yeah.
Her faith is real. It's rich. It's rooted, and she knows that this storm is just that. It's a storm that, but
Mhm.
she just needed to be reaffirmed that I'm going to get forward and just be encouraged.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very beautiful.
Typical Irish, having to be the like withstanding everything in spite of oppression. That seems to be
Yeah,
the Irish history, but
it,
it's good. Like it gives you that spirit and that stamina to
exactly.
continue through difficulty.
Yeah, and also just just that strong determination,
Hmm.
to weather,
Yes.
and I believe that's and it's good because when you look at the pressure that's being really kind of squeezed upon the Emerald Isle, coming from Europe, coming from the West in the sense of the U.S. and other entities, and also the issues that what's happening, and it's a different subject, but how immigration is affecting that in a sense of other cultures coming in and bringing with them their cultures, and how does that affect the Irish culture, and then what's happening with the government, and one of the things that's so concerning, as we see in so many countries, that sadly we witnessed here in the lawfare under the Biden administration, is when pro-lifers speak against the narrative,
Yeah.
when we stand up against the ideological narrative of progressivism.
Hmm.
And this is what people in Ireland are dealing with because of a hate crime bill that's now law.
I'm glad you brought that up because that was going to be my next
Oh,
question
sure.
was since that seems to be a newer development of what's going on in Ireland, could you just give our
Right.
audience a little bit of like synopsis of like what the bill was and when it happened and then how it's impacting people on the ground?
So this bill, it might come under different names,
Hmm.
but ultimately it's a bill that was passed and signed into law in October of 2024.
Hmm.
And ultimately, it's about, though the language of the bill, which is quite extensive, is talking about, protecting people's, rights and religious freedoms and, protecting the vulnerable and the handicapped. But it starts also advocating, obviously for those whose lifestyles, are some things that we would be concerned about. So, advocating, for gender identity, self-identification, and so what happens is, as we see with buffer zones, that are people who are familiar with this, is basically standing outside of an abortion facility or a place where abortions are occurring. They're creating these zones that you can't cross. So, and if you just happen to stand there, and just stand there, no one knows what you're doing, but you can be still charged because you're not that you crossed the line, but you're just standing too close and you're praying. You can't do that,
Hmm.
and so
Even if you're doing it internally, like
internally,
mentally?
just and so just all this thing. So I met someone who's actually been charged with one of
Wow.
these situations,
Wow.
and they're fighting this, all the way up
Hmm.
into the high court. And so these are realities. And
Yeah.
so what that does, as we know, is to stop people from speaking.
Hmm.
We're going to shame you. We're going to beat you down. We're going to prevent your expression so that our narrative continues to be. And this is the thing that always gets me about, and I've been in Ireland many times over the last 14 years. And one thing that's, as many parts of Europe, is all they do is if you just open the shade and look at some of the stats, some of the things we've been talking about, and you realize there's a problem here.
Yeah.
I mean, our younger generation are many of them moving out of Ireland because they can't afford to live in Ireland. So, and they're not coming back to Ireland. We have a low birth rate. We have a divorce rate that's growing. We have all these ideologies, and all this is something that's really causing havoc in Irish culture. So if you open the shade and let the light in and go, well, that's happening in Europe. Look what's happened over there, which they're part of because they're part of the European Union. But the idea is they're dying. Is that what we want? And it's almost like they just it's been so numbed, that's just kind of veiled that so, and you hear it and you're thinking, okay, there is a remedy. There is a remedy here. And so it's how do you awaken that? And so people are looking at this bill, it's now law, and realizing, okay, wait a minute, so I can't say this. So an example of that is people are concerned about the issues of immigration. And I heard that in all the places I was. But yet if you speak up, you're going against the narrative. You're all the things we hear here.
Yeah.
You're anti this, you're anti that, but no one's willing to answer the question. Why is this happening? And so basically they just shut you down. They quiet you down.
Is that an Irish thing, like an Irish government thing, or is that the EU? Because it seems like I'm wondering how much of these issues is Ireland, like qua Ireland, or Ireland because it's part of the EU, what it's kind of being pressured to do from being
well,
part
obviously
of that.
It's their Irish government, so it's their own government that's intruding on these core values, all right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religious expression, and so forth, and also pressure coming from the EU, as we know that Ireland, because you get a little Northern Ireland, it's also part of the UK, so you have those influences, and then you have again all those various cultures, all those various ways of approach are there. So all of this is bringing upon the Irish people a weight, and so. What I love about what Patrick and his team are doing is not only they're talking about the weight, right? That's very important. You cannot bring a remedy if you don't know what it is you're up against.
Yeah.
So by talking about it, exposing it, bringing it into the light, so that light shines on it, it can't hide, right? Then you can provide the remedy, and it's not a new remedy. It's the same remedy that St. Patrick preached.
Yeah.
It's the authenticity of the gospel. It's living out the gospel. It's the sovereignty of the Lord. It's being obedient to his commands, living in the design that he created for man and woman, the dignity of the human person, the sacredness of marriage, the openness to human life, the protection of the vulnerable. This is nothing new. It's the same message, and it's the remedy. And this is what I love about what, and there's many ways of approach. HLI has many strategies of how she approaches. And I really appreciate how Patrick and his team have taken, they're discussing the bioethical issues, the ethical issues and the principles, but they really have put forefront is the spiritual battle, which we know that we're engaged in. And if you would permit me just a moment, I'd like to return, and this is why for Ireland is so important. And I wrote about this in 2018 when the Amendment 8 was rejected, and they brought upon their country the legalization of abortion. And so in 1979, when John Paul went to Galway, and he gave there were about 300,000 youth. This is a mass for the young people. Now today would be obviously in their 50s and and so forth, and maybe even some 60s in there. But the idea is when you think of this, he's speaking to them. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he's looking and saying to them that you are the future of Ireland. You are the ones that are now Christ is calling to be ambassadors, to be the light shining in the darkness. But to do that, you have to be willing to carry that cross. And he's challenging them not to follow the ideologies of the day, not to be tempted or persuaded. And so now these young people that were teenagers at the time, and they're maybe even not teenagers, they're all young people. Well, many of these young people were the same ones whose kids now were the ones voting in the election, who voted for this various atrocities that they brought upon their own nation. And I couldn't help but think, about John Paul. He says, when I look at you, I see the Ireland of the future. Tomorrow you will be the living force of your country. You will decide what Ireland will be. There's the prophetic word there. And so I still say those words are very, very important because a new generation has come. sadly because of a lack of catechesis, poor formation. Even the Archbishop of Armagh and many others have said this, and it's so true. And as I mentioned in my article, not to kind of pull out a Band-Aid again on an old wound, but we know the crisis, we know the scandals, we know the difficulties we see within the church as well has not helped. And so we're seeing a low number of vocations in many of the dioceses. We're seeing the amalgamating of dioceses in Ireland. So as you said, and that's why I want to pull back to the vision of St. Patrick, and if it's whatever that, in a sense, again, not all lost.
No.
But God does permit, as we know in our own salvation history, these moments of, in the sense of bringing us to these, of our own choice. These are our own designs that we've done to ourselves. He's never abandoned us. He will never leave us. And he promised to remain with us. And so maybe this is the moment of refinement, of time for reparation, a time of transformation and renewal. In a sense, it's relighting that fire and saying that you think is gone, but it's not. It's there. And so, but we need people to preach. We need people to teach. So we need the adorers. And I love, again, what Patrick and HLI Ireland have been doing, in a sense, promoting prayers of reparation. We need to amend for what we have done, which is the men's rosary.
Yeah.
They're amending and saying, we have not stood by our wives. We have not stood by women. We have allowed abortion. We have allowed contraception. We have allowed divorce. We have allowed all this because we have not done our part. So if that's what it takes to reawaken, then Ireland can be a light, another spark in the world, and maybe be that flame again, as it did for so many generations of being the missionaries to the world. Right now, she needs to be re-evangelized. Yeah. She needs to be revitalized. And I thoroughly enjoyed the mission and meeting these wonderful people from across mostly the eastern side of Ireland.
Yeah.
But many came over from middle and some from the west to be part of the programs. So we're already talking about returning, because we want to continue, this momentum and strike while the iron's hot. People are awakening.
I have a question about the pregnancy care centers. How common is that in Ireland? Because when I interviewed Dr. Dermot Carney, who he is Irish, but he's based out of the UK right now, and he does abortion pill reversals and basically got taken to the UK's highest court over that. And he was talking about the delay between American culture and the UK culture, of how we had abortion pill reversal here about 10 years before it was something going on over there. And I feel like pregnancy centers is something that's becoming more and more common here in the US. We have there's thriving ones all over. Is that a cultural thing that's common in Ireland, or is that are the ones that Patrick runs few and far between? It's his 3 and nothing else.
There are a few. There are a few. And I mean, there are others that are involved. I don't know the numbers, but I know they're low. So, but what's beautiful though is that in 2024, and it sounds low, but they had documented 60, I think it was 63 or 64 moms and their children were saved because of those then 2, 3. So the more these centers are available, and as we know in all of our work, in our own experience, that when those centers are made known and people hear about them, we know that people find answers to their dilemmas, their difficulties. And we know that abortion is never, ever a solution, ever. But that's all they believe is the solution, because they don't have opportunity to find places of help. And so that's why, these centers are so important. And what we did in those communities is we talked about them, and many people, even within the very active in their faith, were even unaware. So again, bringing more attention to them allows the faith communities in those areas to talk about them and to make people aware of them and to support them. And that was also part of the mission, was to awaken that.
Well, that's something I do like to kind of bring up here on the podcast, of just how the pro-life movement in other countries, even other developed countries, like countries in Europe, is so different than the US. In the US, we're despite all of our problems, we're blessed to have this beautiful saturation of all these different pro-life groups with their different charisms doing all this wonderful work. And I think it's easy to forget that places even like Ireland and the UK don't necessarily have that. We're blessed here in the US to have so many thriving parishes and thriving dioceses, even though, again, there are still many problems. And we realize that isn't always the case in other countries. And
Correct.
so just the importance
Right.
of being able to provide those resources and be able to help like bring that catechesis back and educate people and bring that flame back.
Exactly. It's that's why there's many ways of approachment,
Hmm.
and so it's important to have all of them. And you're right. I mean, I think one of the things that Ireland struggles. So we talk about being kind of 10 years behind or 10 years
Hmm.
ahead, depends where you are in the world. But there is a lot of truth to that
Yeah.
because it depends on how the influence comes in. The stronger the influence from the West, in a sense of radio, TV, movies, of government intrusion,
Hmm.
it speeds up the process. And if I may, I'm going to use my hands, which I already do all the time anyway. So sorry about that. Maybe if I sit on them, but I won't be able to talk that much. Is people every one of the places we went to said, "How did this happen overnight?" Well, it might look like it happened overnight. It did not. So this has been incrementally growing. So if I may, I use a seesaw. And
Okay.
so basically, when you have, and I'm going to use John Paul's beautiful teaching, culture of life, spirit of death, culture of death. So when you look at this and you realize that it's kind of been looks like a tat for tat, over the years. So, but when you start thinking about in 2015 when we legalized same-sex union, you can start seeing weight. So all of a sudden you start seeing this lift, and
Mhm.
so now you're no longer talking about just ideologies. You're not speaking about just protesting and so forth. Now you have law. Now you have an intrusion by law. You having something forced upon the nation. It's changing mindset. So for a long time, maybe you had the perverse sex education, but you had solid families. The church was more involved. But as those things begin to wane, and then in 2018, so all of a sudden that weight begins to happen, and all of a sudden the spirit of death, the culture of death, boom. And for many people, it says, wow, whoa, wait, how did this happen all of a sudden? Well, it has not been all of a sudden.
Mhm.
It's basically been because we haven't been on guard. We haven't been as attentive. We
Mhm.
haven't been as vigilant. We haven't been confronting the situation. Many times we think, like we've seen everywhere around the world, oh, it'll never happen here.
Mhm.
And there it is. And the devil uses everything. The same thing with that small percentage, but a percentage nonetheless of scandals and of violence done to young people. He uses all of it to bring down credibility of the bishops, credibility of the church in Ireland, all that stuff he uses, and pop, there it is. And so I think for people, they're thinking, Colleen, wait a minute. So how do we, in a sense now, how do we not get this way now? We don't want him even. How
Yeah.
do we do this?
Yeah.
And it is very, very, and the pregnancy care centers, and those are very heavy
Mhm.
because it brings tremendous weight to our conversation that we know there's an answer. And we know the chastity, the purity programs, the adherence to marriage, all that
Mhm.
pulls that weight back. But it's going to take a country and a culture to reject these evils, these intrinsic evils that they have sadly welcomed
Mhm.
into their native land.
It also goes to show just like with education of how things can change like seemingly overnight, but like in a generation or two. Like if like I'm not saying specifically about Ireland, but just kind of saying in general, you could have really strong generation who firmly believes their faith and like has all these values, but if you don't know how to pass that on to the next generation,
That's right.
and there's a vacuum. Like if that isn't being filled by the culture of life, there's a vacuum created which the devil is going to get in.
That's right.
And I think there's also, again,
Amen.
not saying this happened in Ireland, but I wouldn't be surprised given how Catholic it was,
Right.
of how there can probably be a sense of complacency of like, oh, we have the faith, we go to mass, this is like our culture. And then again,
Right.
if you're going through the motions and not necessarily having it transform your hearts or
Right.
transform your education and how you engage with
That's
like
correct.
your daily decisions,
That's correct.
is very
That's
quick.
correct.
One thing that struck me when I was looking at dates leading up to this episode was the gap between when contraception was legalized in Ireland and abortion. And that was really surprising to me because when we put together the contraception ebook a couple of years ago, we have one section comparing how contraception being legal is often followed by abortion and
Right.
how that pattern of contraception leading to abortion is like followed throughout the world. Like
Right.
contraception creates the abortion mindset and the anti-child mindset, and then abortion becomes backup birth control.
Right.
Do you know why the gap was so big in Ireland?
No, I mean like many other places. It depends on the influences, the cultural
Hmm.
influence. I mean, maybe you saw something while you were reading. Did it give any impression
No,
of why?
no, I just
But it was
was,
a gap, and it was,
yeah.
but part of it, is again, the culture was so hesitant. That's my when listening.
Mhm.
But if I go back, and this has never been documented, right? I've never seen it in writing. I've heard the story many, many times that when Humanae Vitae was promulgated, as we saw in the United States, we saw in many parts of the world where there are some pockets of rejection, outwardly rejecting the document. We saw the same thing in Ireland. And I understand that it was a very strong rejection among many of those in the hierarchy. And I've never been able to find, I've just in writing, I've never seen anything that,
Yeah.
substantiate
Just
percentage, whatever, but I
anecdotal.
heard it so often in all of my times. But it would make sense to me because as you keep whittling down and you're not teaching, then the momentum begins to pick up. So, yeah, so even though something may be not legalized, doesn't mean it wasn't being practiced.
Mhm.
So, and I think that's the challenge. But you just gave a fantastic history of how the mindset moves.
Mhm.
And so, as the mindset grows with a contraceptive mentality, then we would eventually see, the acceptance of abortion, using it not only as a backup plan, but basically just running toward it, as this so-called solution.
Mhm.
But also just the way that, as you just said earlier, when you have certain countries that are 10 years behind, whatever that time frame is,
Yeah.
yes, we can see how the momentum takes a little more time. And because of communication, because of the way that each of the rural communities act, how each diocese may be addressing it. So
Mhm.
I would love to. I mean, I've brought this up many times. Patrick McChrystal, as anyone knows his history, was a pharmacist. I'd say he still is in a sense of his vocation. But when imposed upon him that he had to start prescribing or filling, excuse me, prescriptions for contraception, he was confronted with a reality that he said he could not do. And so he abandoned his vocation because of the way the government was pushing.
In a good way.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah. In the sense of as a pharmacist and
yeah.
saying, I will not fill prescriptions. I will not participate in this grave evil. I cannot do this. And to the point where he couldn't find work,
Mhm.
and this is when HLI Ireland at the time was looking for a new director. And this is when 27 years ago, Patrick found himself, in a moment of time to be part of a large mission
Mhm.
and to recognize what Father Marx had said so many times: abortion will lead to that contraception. I mean, contraception will lead to abortion.
That is like the perfect story. It's like the Irish government when they were like forcing pharmacists to have to fill like contraceptives probably didn't know they were creating this like radical pro-life
Yeah,
leader out of
they
it in
help.
like the most positive way. It's
Yeah,
like
they
the
help
opposite
shape
of a
him.
villain
That's
origin
right.
story. It's like the hero origin story.
In just the sense that I mean, I can't speak to the other pro-life groups that are working there, but I do know,
Yeah.
listening to our team in HLI Ireland, that the issue of contraception, just like it is in many pro-life groups here in the United States, never talk about it.
Mm.
And as I wrote just recently, and I continue to ring that bell, we will never ever take away the mindset of abortion and eliminate abortions from in the mindset of it until we eliminate the contraceptive mentality, which feeds it. And so that's the skunk in the room that very few people want to address.
Mhm.
So and so this is obviously why today we look at the difficulty in Ireland today. Contraception has been basically normalized, as it is in most of the West,
Mhm.
and now abortion is growing. And when I share the statistics, with them, when from 2018, what was the number in 19, what was the number in 20, and so forth,
Mhm.
it's just going up. It's
Yeah.
just going up, and it will continue to escalate.
Do you know offhand if it's chemical or surgical abortion that's dominant?
So what according to the IE government site, it's
Mhm.
speaking of a procured, so basically a surgical
Okay.
abortion. I didn't see the numbers, and that in detail enough to tell
Mhm.
me if we're talking about a pharmaceutical, i.e., the abortion pill. But we all know that is growing in number.
Do you know if they have abortion pill reversal there?
Some of the doctors there are because they're, even though, and someone can always correct me, but as far as I understand, that the Catholic Medical Association is not active currently in Ireland. There are members there. I'm not sure. I was last told that they were not organized. So that I would say that would be a wonderful thing to see happen,
Mhm.
to reorganize, reinstitute themselves. But I do know doctors there that are involved in that pill reversal,
Okay.
because I met some of them.
Yeah.
But is the but again, because of the government,
Mhm. That's what I was trying to remember when I talked to Dr. Dermot Carney. I was trying to remember if he talked about Ireland too, or if it was just the UK, and I don't remember because I know that
Right,
there are some, like he does it in the UK, and there's other doctors, some who wish to remain anonymous, who do it.
right,
But I can't remember if he told me about Ireland too, and I wish I remembered because that would
right,
be so helpful to
right.
incorporate into this. So people just have to go listen to that episode to find
Yeah,
out.
exactly. But but these are just many of the challenges.
Yeah.
And again, as Pope Francis, has mentioned many times over the years, as an aging population, that's the other side that we
Hmm.
we really haven't talked about in great detail. I know we're getting toward the end of our podcast, obviously, but we've been talking about so many things. But now you see the mindset of
Hmm.
euthanasia, of assisted suicide, the mindset of, as we do with contraception, I'm the one in control. I determine when life will begin or not begin, a sense of being open or not open. And so we see this now, that contraceptive mentality
Hmm.
is now made its way to the end of life. And this is what Father Marx said to John Paul II in 1979. And this is when John Paul gave that wonderful long phrase to Father Marx about taking his work around the world. But it is linked, because if I'm against life, contra life, in the very beginning, it's in the marital act, I'm in contra, then that mindset carries toward the end of life. Because if we place a value and devalue life at its beginning, then we will devalue life at its end, especially when it's becomes burdensome and the person becomes a burden to society. And who determines that? Obviously, many people who have power over other people, just as at the beginning of life. So this is the challenge for Ireland.
Hmm.
But as I said earlier, and I think that's just a great way just to say that, that the faith is there.
Hmm.
An example of that, when I landed in Dublin, I just early in the morning, I walk off the plane, I come down the alley heading toward, immigration, and I come across workers. And, good morning, Father. Hello, Father. And some making just a sign of the cross as I pass by, and older, younger, have a good day, Father. It's just, so there's something, again, and I don't know where these people are in their faith journey. Are they practicing? Not or not? Where are they? But there's, again, something there, and you can feel it, and you realize when you travel, and the challenges, the martyrdom, the sufferings, the difficulties the Irish people have faced, for centuries, has really molded them, shaped them, created some of the greatest saints that we've seen.
Yeah.
All that is still there. All of it is there. And I walked away when I got on the plane, and especially because I stayed with the Benedictine priory before leaving, and it was enriching, to look at how their numbers are growing, young men coming, and you're watching again. It's this. It might be slow. It may be under the radar. Many people might not be noticing, but it's there. And so, and this is how that flame, that little spark, becomes a flame. And as that momentum grows, I go back to my little seesaw, all of a sudden that which seemed to be in charge begins to lose its weight. And all of a sudden we start watching. I believe that's there. The potential is there.
Do you think that there's such thing as like spiritual DNA or spiritual genes? Like I feel like certain cultures they have charisms. Like
Mhm,
you have like the Italians who talk a lot and they have like they love their
mhm,
food and their drink, and you have like the Russians who are like
mhm,
very like cold, and like you have like Dostoevsky versus like like different cultures have different like emotions or like certain ways that they come across. Do you think that there's like something like that spiritually too, where different cultures have like these different spiritual gifts that they have? Because I feel like the Irish have these very strong spiritual roots, and that can
mhm,
be positive in how strong their faith is, or it can be negative in like the
mhm,
Druids of old and like all of those like kind of
mhm.
stories and like witchy kind of
Right.
themes. Do you think there's something with that?
Well, what I would say is in response is that the faith and the presence of God in Ireland through the church, through that faith journey, is deep. It
Mhm.
runs deep, and even though maybe a lack of formation, catechesis has blinded people to it, but you can't go to any village,
Mhm.
any other communities and not see a Catholic church. And the names of those saints, they're on the Irish airplanes. and and the different saint names are on them. So people are, in a sense, thrown into that environment, and so it's there. Now, whether it's, you want to call it Irish DNA, I mean, I call it the fact of God's gift to us, that I'm with you, and that, and the idea is that the people of Ireland have had that rich history. It is present, and it's in the air, it's in the soil, and as I said in my article, this, and I use spirit here in a sense. St. Francis, St. Patrick is a living being, right? And so he lived among the people in the 5th century. He walked those lands, and right, and so he is a saint, and we believe in the communion of saints. He is still there. And so are all the other saints that have come, from that great land, and and who have given to the world. It is there. So we can call it many things, but they are present. We believe, as a Catholic people, in the communion of saints.
And they're interceding for
And
Ireland.
and even those that have not been declared saints, many saints have come from that land. Many moms, many dads, many families, many individuals, and whose legacy is passed on. And you meet them when you see them praying their rosary. You meet them when you see them kneeling in the churches in adoration. They are there. And so I do believe, that of all the places I've been around the world, Ireland is very unique, because in Italy, you just mentioned, many saints, St. Peter, St. Paul, all the, so yes, there's something very deep, runs deep. Ireland is one of those places. It runs deep, and I think that, it's just a matter of, we have to unearth it, and back to why I'm very proud of Patrick McChrystal and his team, who are tirelessly working, to reawaken, to unearth that faith, and going down the highways, and you see the Holy Face image on a billboard. When you hear of the processions, and you hear of the Sacred Heart statues being blessed, I believe if I understand correctly, they were blessed by Pope Francis. Now they come back to Ireland, and they're going to now have a pilgrimage with them. That stirs, and it stirs. So I'm hopeful that maybe, as a soon-to-be 59-year-old, that the Lord lets me be 100-year-old, that I'll see something very different. Yeah, because I believe it is there, and I put my own hand on it. I mean, I as much as we do, and that is address the difficulties. We are a people of faith. We are a people of hope. We are a people of joy, and I will say that that's the message we have to keep bringing. We confront many evils, we confront many mindsets, and yes, is going to take a lot of work. But that's what the saints did of old. This is our task now. And ours is to awaken. So I would say, that's why in my article that's going to be coming out, I put the prayer that's attributed to St. Patrick, the breastplate, which is long. I put a shorter version, but it's just the idea that we have to pray for strength. We have to pray, for protection. We have to pray to recognize Christ in front of me, Christ behind me, Christ to my left, Christ to my right, Christ all around me. So this understanding that Christ is here, that's what we have to have.
Amen. Well, thank you, Father. This has been great to just hear about. I'm glad that there's hope for Ireland, because obviously I love Ireland. I've been there a couple times, and I'm just like, it's sad when you have places like Ireland and Poland and these countries that like you think of as these vibrant Catholic countries, like crumbling in like against the culture of death. And I'm glad that you still see those sparks there.
Yes.
So
that's what gets us up in the morning and keeps us going.
Amen. And to all of our listeners, please like, subscribe. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star review, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.